Me, I'm in sunny Philadelphia. As you probably picked up, I, I don't have a Philadelphia accent. I grew up in Michigan, rural Michigan. Although all of Michigan is pretty rural, I grew up in a very rural area, which was nice. There was a lot that was good about that. You know, I'm not complaining, but it's also it was a little bit limiting in terms of opportunities. So I immediately moved away as soon as I graduated college because there just wasn't much for me there. And so, of course, I wanted to be a cartoonist from an early age. And my college, I did a BFA degree, Bachelor of Fine Arts, and all of my work for my senior thesis was comics and cartoons. Although at that time, I was very much into political cartooning. I liked editorial cartoons that appeared in the newspaper. I liked Bloom County and Doonesbury an awful lot. And so they brought in from the Detroit Free Press, they brought in a cartoonist, the editorial cartoonist for the Freep, whose name was Bill Day. And he kind of juried the senior show. And then we had dinner later, and I'm like, okay, how do I get a job? How do I get your job? How do I get a job as an editorial cartoonist? He says, well, he says there's about 150 jobs. This was in 1991. He goes, there's about 150 jobs for editorial cartoonists in the United States, and they're all taken. And he says, we're all waiting for somebody at one of the good newspapers or even a better newspaper to die. And when that person dies, then we all move up one, and a space opens up at the worst newspaper in the United States that still hires an editorial cartoonist. And that's where you and about 1,000 other people just like you, that's where you're all going to fight to get in. And then you join the waiting game for somebody at a better newspaper to die. He said that's basically the career trajectory, is waiting for people to die. So and so he said, so here's what you do. You get a job at a good newspaper as an editorial artist, as a graphic artist in the news side, not the advertising side, because they tend to build a wall between those two, and for good reason. But they tend to build a wall between news and editorial. And if you come in from the ad side, they're never going to trust you. But if you come in as a news side graphic artist, then you'll have a really good job where you use your art skills, your graphic design and so forth. You'll have a good job, and you can submit editorial cartoons on the side, and they will be thrilled to have you, because now they might not be able to afford to have a full-time editorial cartoonist, but they'll be just absolutely thrilled to take something that you drew in your spare time, or maybe even give you some time during your shift to do it. And then they get an editorial cartoonist, and everybody wins. And so that's what I did. I started looking through this magazine, a trade journal called Editor and Publisher, and it was just all about the newspaper industry. And at the time, this would have been the early '90s, and desktop publishing was just kind of getting started in places like newspapers, and color printing, believe it or not, was just becoming more widely used. And so graphic artists were being hired at newspapers left and right, especially ones that could work fast and ones who were, had usable skills. And usable for the most part meant knowing how to use Mac software. And that was me. I had exactly the skill set they needed. Plus, since I was just out of college, I was cheap. I was a easy hire in that respect because I was exactly what they wanted and I was cheap and I was ballsy as fuck. I found an ad in Editor and Publisher for a newspaper in Canton, Ohio. And I did exactly what all of the books said not to do because I hadn't read the books. And I called the editor in chief directly in his office. And hey, I see you're looking for a graphic artist, and that's what I do. And it just so happens I'm going to be in Canton next Friday. And would you like me to drop my portfolio off? And he's taken aback for a second, and he goes, "Sure, you can drop your portfolio off." And I immediately made plans to be in Canton, Ohio by the next Friday. I was at that time living in Battle Creek, Michigan, where Kellogg's cereal is based. And I was doing an internship there. And so I immediately made plans to be down in Canton, Ohio the next Friday. And I showed up and talked myself into the building and dropped off my portfolio and started talking to people. And, things went really well. And I sent everybody thank you notes through the mail the next day before I left the Knights Inn over in Belden Village and made sure that they would get their thank you notes right away and went home. And by the next week, they were on the phone with a job offer. And that's how I started in newspapers. I had just no fear, and no common sense either, but no fear. And so I got in there and I started working, and I found out that I had a real flair for infographics, diagrams and charts, stuff that newspapers were churning out like crazy because they finally realized in the '90s they were competing with TV, and that was a visual medium. And so them running a 70-inch story that went through page after page of gray text, people weren't going to read that. But if they paired that with photos and colorful informational graphics that would help tell the story, then they realized that they got a real response when they did that. And people actually read their stories. I shouldn't say actually, I'm sure they would have read them anyway, but there was a higher retention rate. So I found out I was really good at that. And of course, I do need to say the repository was a union paper, and I always worked at union papers. And I always got paid better and got better benefits than my friends that I had met through newspapers that weren't, for doing the same job. And it was good work, it was good benefits, and it was all art related. And I did cartoons on the side. Which was awesome. You know, it was such a great time. We were making this shit up as we went along, and the more I went down that road, the more I started doing infographics more and more, and cartoons less and less. And I started going to uh, newspaper design conventions. There was a group called SND, the Society for Newspaper Design, and I'd gotten really involved with that. And cartoons were getting less and less. And then it got to be about 1998, and I I got headhunted by the Philadelphia Daily News. They had seen my stuff probably through SND, and they wanted me bad. And it was tough because I had just interviewed with the Baltimore Sun, and we had gotten to the point where I put a deposit down for me and my fiance at the time for an apartment in Baltimore. And at the last minute, we had a disagreement about the contract. Basically, they said that a certain part of the contract was not going to be applied, and I said that that was a deal breaker, and they said they weren't going to change it. So I thanked them very much and went on my way. And I had gotten that far, and it was it was around this time of year. It was October, and or I should say September, early October. So I had gone to DEF CON 5 with these guys, and my wedding was coming up, and I didn't want to go through this whole process again with the Daily News that I had just gone through with the Baltimore Sun. So I told them no. I said, forget about it. Can't do it. And you've got to understand, the Philadelphia Daily News is a tabloid, and they were doing the greatest tabloid journalism ever. It was real news. It was solid news, but it was done with an attitude, or as they say here in Philadelphia, attitude. And since it was a tabloid, it was a smaller page size. So when I did a graphic, a lot of times I would take up the entire page or half a page. I'd have room. They wanted me to fill a page with a graphic, and they loved my illustrations, my cartoons. They loved cartoon illustration. It fit them perfectly. Where I had been working at that point, the Akron Beacon Journal, after I left the Canton paper, Akron Beacon Journal didn't like cartoons at all. So I didn't get a chance to draw there at all. And they already had an editorial cartoonist. But wow, the news loved everything about what I was doing. And it was the perfect fit. And I sat there. They sent me a bunch of stuff about, like clips and articles from editor and publisher about what they were doing, and what kind of paper they were all about. And they had a columnist that was called the Phantom Strap Hanger, and he covered the Uh, he covered the subway system, the public transportation system, buses, and mass transit. And he was so feared by SEPTA, the public transportation agency, that um, he kept his identity secret, because if people knew who he was, uh, they, the story went, they would cause all kinds of trouble for him, because he was always exposing, wrongdoing, doing what newspapers are supposed to do, standing up for the people and exposing wrongdoing. And he was everything about that paper was perfect. And my wife, well, she wasn't my wife yet. She was my fiance. We're looking through all these pages, and she goes, "If you don't at least take the interview, I'm canceling the wedding." And I'm like, "Why?" And she said, "Because you'll be miserable, and you'll blame the wedding. You will have missed an incredible opportunity." She says, "You at least have to go down and take the interview." So I took the interview and just fell in love. Just fell in love with the newspaper. I mean, it was incredible. And I had a job offer by the end of the week. And with my wedding mere weeks away, I started a new job in Philadelphia. So I started in Philly for 2 weeks, during which they put me up in a hotel, hired a real estate agent to help me find an apartment. 2 weeks later, after my first day, they I flew back to Ohio, got married, went on my honeymoon, and all this time, while during my first 2 weeks, they sent a moving company over to Ohio. This was a very different time for newspapers, you guys. This was this was the late '90s, before newspapers had completely wrecked themselves, and they sent a moving crew over, and my wife supervised the move out from our apartment in Ohio. I came over, we got married, we went for our honeymoon down in Disney World. And while we were on honeymoon, my new boss at the Daily News was supervising the movers, moving the stuff in to my new apartment in Philadelphia. This guy that I didn't even know hardly, except for a couple of weeks. He supervised the movers. He coming into and so we ended our honeymoon in Orlando, flew back to Philadelphia, where and while we're still in Orlando, he FedExes my new apartment keys to me, so that they show up at the Polynesian resort in Disney World. And then we flew back to Philadelphia, walked into our apartment, to an apartment full of boxes and furniture, and on top of two of the boxes that were right there by the entrance, a bottle of wine and a couple of glasses, and a note from him welcoming us to our new lives. And that's how we started in Philadelphia. And I loved it. It was a great job. I stayed at the Daily News until 2012. Hey, this is Brad. Make sure you like that video and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you'd like to see future live stream chats. If you'd like to be part of the next live stream chat as it's happening, you can become a Patreon backer at patreon.com/Guigar. And if you'd like to hear me talking even more about comics and making a living from comics, I'm joined by my good friend Dave Kellett every week on the Comic Lab podcast. That's available any place you get your podcasts. Also, check out
webcomics.com. That's a site I've been doing for nearly 10 years now with news, tutorials, information, and advice for the working web cartoonists. And don't forget, you can pick up my book, The Webcomics Handbook, at amazon.com. Thanks again, and I hope you're having a great day.